Hello, I'm Father Mark Villano from the University Catholic Center. We have a tradition here. Periodically, we'll have a faculty staff gathering at the center where we invite those faculty or staff who have a connection to us at the University Catholic Center to come for a social, but also to hear a presentation from one of their peers. And this winter quarter, 2021, we decided to do that in a virtual way. And we invited Dr. Maryanne Wolf to come and speak with us. I'm going to share my screen right now and show you her picture at least, and just give the introduction. The reason I'm recording this now is because when she gave her presentation, we didn't start the recording until a little way into it, so we lost the introduction. I'm going to give that introduction and then allow her talk to continue, which is very complete in itself. So just a little bit about Maryanne Wolf. Maryanne is a scholar, a teacher, and an advocate for children and literacy around the world. She's the director of the newly created Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice here at UCLA, the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies. Dr. Wolf completed her doctorate at Harvard University in the Department of Human Development and Psychology, where she began her work in cognitive neuroscience and psycholinguistics on the reading brain, language, and dyslexia. She has undergraduate and master's degrees in English literature from St. Mary's College at Notre Dame and Northwestern University. She's the author of more than 160 scientific articles and a number of books, including Proust and the Squid, The Story and Science of the Reading Brain, that's from 2007, HarperCollins, and Reader Come Home, The Reading Brain in a Digital World, 2018, also from HarperCollins. Her list of awards is extensive, but I'll mention that she was a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University, and she was director of the Center for the Reading Brain and Language Research at Tufts University. She's currently working with the UCSF School of Medicine and the faculty at Chapman University on issues related to dyslexia, and is an external advisor to the International Monetary Fund, a research advisor to the Canadian Children's Literacy Foundation, and a frequent speaker at the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. So we are very, very happy to be able to welcome Dr. Maryanne Wolf to speak to our faculty and staff.
I want to contextualize us historically as saying we are moving in this moment in time in one of the great transitions in human communication. The first, of course, was when we moved as a species into a linguistic species where language was our means of communication. And then, a blink of the evolutionary eye, and is all we have in terms of 6,000 years is the length of time we have had as a literate species. But that time has been changing exponentially in the last several years in making us not simply a literate society, but a digital one. And I'm very interested in how that changes us, how that changes children, how it changes the individual trajectory, how it changes society. And indeed, I go so far as to say that changes that will be evolving because of a digital culture will have great ramifications for the species itself, because the human brain, when it learned to read, did something remarkable. And that is, what we began to do was to change that brain by the connections that were made through literacy. Now, I think I will go back here and be sure to emphasize the last line. This whole presentation, if you will, this discussion with you is not a binary one. I'm going to suggest, as all of us know, that there's both great promise, but also particular perils as we move into digital culture. And just as Father Villano's beautiful quote from Thomas Aquinas stated, having different views is really important for us right now, but to be able to understand them is my own intellectual charge. And I remember another quote, Father Mark, I don't know if you remember it, that Thomas Aquinas said, and I'm paraphrasing, but he once said in an argument, iron tempers iron, iron fashions iron. And what he was saying is that he welcomed argumentation because it sharpens, iron sharpens iron. And I say that before this slide that I started to present to you. I hope you can see that, that I am actually going all the way back to our philosopher Nicholas of Cusa, who had a very special way of looking at what happens when there are truths that coincide, but that seem to have that seem to lie in intellectual opposition. And he had a beautiful line that he used, and it was called learned ignorance, not learned ignorance, but learned ignorance, in which when we are confronted with truths that seem in opposition, we, by necessity, have to take he didn't say 40,000 foot up because that wouldn't have been a metaphor for him, but for us it is. How do we go above and look at this with all our intelligence, both of these truths about promise and perils? And I use Nicholas of Cusa, and Professor Nagy, you may well know the work of my mentor at Notre Dame. I studied with Father John Estan, and he was a great influence. In fact, if I were dedicating this talk, as I very rarely do, but I would dedicate it to the memory of Father John Donne, who really talked so eloquently about Nicholas of Cusa and the necessity of looking at this concept of learned ignorance. But there's someone else who actually didn't finish a dissertation on this, but was working on it, and it would have been a dissertation. And this is Romano Guardini, and he was looking at what happens when we have polar opposites in theology and philosophy. And of all things, our Pope Francis, when he was writing, again, it was not a dissertation, but it was towards one, he, and many of you may know much more about this than I do, but I was surprised and delighted to know that part of the intellectual work by Pope Francis was actually based on Guardini and included Nicholas of Cusa about what we do to reconcile thinking about polar opposites. And in a very odd way, that is what I have been doing over the last decade and a half, because it is not from a stance of, if you will, opposition to technology that I am working, but in that learned stance. What can we learn about the importance of technology in its various ways? And so I have been, for the last 10 years, working with various groups on global literacy using technology as a way of disseminating knowledge and providing more equity. So I have worked in schools, especially in Africa, especially in Ethiopia and South Africa, with the many children who have no school. Now, with COVID, the figure of children with no school, this was my slide a year ago. We don't know now how many children have no school. We do know Nicholas Kristof just wrote an op-ed about what is happening in our world, and he used the figure that we have at least minimal 72 million more children who will not become literate, in addition to the 120 or 150. This figure varies. In fact, it's gone all the way up to 200 in some estimates, who are really functionally illiterate, because so many of the literacy criteria are just are so basic that none of us would consider that a literate human being. And I use literate as the means of talking about the foundation for education and the intellectual trajectory. And for those of you whose association is immediate in your mind, am I saying that you do not have, I'm going to assume that some of you are going to say, what about all those cultures that are oral cultures? Am I saying they are less intelligent or have a less? No, I am not making that statement at all. Think Socrates, probably one of the most amazing, extraordinary minds we have. But what I am saying is that in our historical epoch, literacy gives us the capacity for the democratization of that knowledge. We can't all be in a Greek courtyard with Socrates in the way that oral language was able to educate. So please know, if that was a question in your mind, how I'm considering that non-literate culture. But I am working with a group called Curious Learning, a global literacy project that works in Boston at Tufts and MIT Media Lab, especially in Georgia State University and other places, in which we take digital tablets, and we are especially trying to make apps that mimic parts of the reading brain. So neuroscience helped us begin the curation of apps, and then the creation of apps for children that would be precursors of literacy. And this is a group that we worked with first in Ethiopia. And I will just point out this one little boy here. He was one of the most amazing children I have ever met in my life, with no electricity, no anything. I've never seen anything. He was able to turn his tablet on within minutes, and he yelled to everyone, "I'm the lion! I turned it on!" This was an extraordinary experience for all of us to see how capable children are, who have these children had never seen a pencil or paper, much less one of these. You can see how we had to encase them in something that would not be destroyed almost immediately. But this began a series of deployments that we have made in India, Uganda, South Africa, and other places, and also rural US, in seeing how tablets can be used for the democratization of knowledge. And my colleagues and I, when I moved here, I'm no longer as intimately involved. I'm only an advisor. I helped create it, but it's gone so far beyond me. But they are now creating apps that are translated into more than 45 languages, that are developing pre-literacy skills. So I put that in front of you so that you don't assume that I am simply a critic of digital technology. I am both an advocate of its careful use, and in COVID, we would not be together. We couldn't have this Zoom meeting. I couldn't be in Singapore tomorrow night, in New York City, Saturday morning. We couldn't do so many of the things, but there are costs. And I have been particularly worried about the costs for our children, who are spending so much time in front of screens. And so one of the things that I want to bring to bear in my talk with you is understanding what are the what are the processes I am most concerned about? And indeed they are critical analysis and empathy. And now it'll be my delight in helping you understand that particular perspective. And it begins with understanding how the reading brain ever developed in the first place. You see, none of you were born to read. You were born to see, to think, to talk, all these wonderful things. There was no reading circuit in the brain. The circuitry for language, the circuitry for vision, the circuitry for thought were connected, but they were never connected in the specific refined ways that the reading circuit requires. So what has happened, and I can see I have to put a little more light in LA, I have to have a little more light here now. What happens is that the brain has this beautiful generative capacity. It can make a new circuit for new cognitive functions. That's why anything new that you learn is going to be developing a particular circuit. Well, the reading circuit is one that is extremely beautiful because it makes new connections among these original genetically programmed parts: vision, language, cognition, but also emotion, also motoric systems. So that reading brain, and I'll show you this a little later, is wonderfully complex, but it begins in a very small, basic way. And that basic circuit depends on several factors. One of them is the writing system. Those of you who speak Spanish or German or Dutch or Italian, you have a circuit for reading with that writing system that is slightly different from the way the English circuit is. But if you speak Japanese or Chinese, the circuit is even more different because the writing system requires different things of the brain. I'll just use one tiny example. The Chinese child at 5th grade is going to learn more than likely up 5,000 characters. Well, that's going to make a difference in the visual processes, the occipital area. So if you see that middle line, you'll see that the Chinese writing system and Japanese kanji both require more, if you will, cortical space in different parts of the brain than an alphabet would. So that just gives you a quick, if you will, glimpse at how plastic that reading brain circuit is. Now, the real problem is that digital platforms, the screen, is also going to make a difference on the circuit. So print actually is going to advantage some of the slower processes that I'm going to be talking about in just a few minutes, what I call the deep reading processes, than the digital, which is going to advantage fast processing of a lot of information. So I want to just make the first point, and then I will elaborate it, that the writing system and the medium change the circuit of the reading brain. Now, once you realize that, our colleague Patricia Greenfield at UCLA has done some fascinating work before I ever knew her, in which she said basically that every medium has its cost and its weaknesses. That, of course, the digital, it has this beautiful promise and strength in visual processing and gathering great amounts of information. But the cost seems to be in what she and I call deep processing, processes that require more time. And we will get into that in just a minute about what that really means for us. But before we do, I have to back up just a little bit and talk about what those processes are. Now, When you learn to read, you are putting together a very basic circuit in decoding. So some of my kids in Africa, like my lion boy, my lion prince, he learned how to decode. I can't tell you what an exciting moment it is for us to realize we can teach kids to decode. But that's just the beginning. The decoding processes then has to begin to converge. And so what the brain is actually elaborating over time, these much more complicated processes. Background knowledge. So what you're doing when you read is you take what you know in your brain, your repertoire, your repository of knowledge, and you connect it to what the text is. Now, that's just the first step, but it means that that background knowledge is extremely important. Now, I'll look at this slide with you because I want you, some of you may know the beautiful work of Umberto Manguel, who wrote A History of Reading and many books since. And what he said is very important. Reading is cumulative. Look at the books behind you. Some of you have boxes, some of you have libraries, but all of you have content from books that have collectively and geometrically added to whatever you read before. So as Umberto said, reading is cumulative and proceeds with geometric progression. Each new reading builds upon what the reader has read before. Or not. Now there's where my worries come from. What about the children who don't have that repertoire? We are not going to have the same kind of reading brain if that background knowledge is not there. Human beings are analogy makers. They make analogies between what they know and whatever's in front of them, whatever is new. If that background knowledge is insufficient, we have a problem from the start, which is why it is essential that even though that's not the purpose of my talk with you, my purpose out in the world is to ensure that our children from 0 to 5 and 5 to 10 are building that basis of background knowledge. But for you, I simply want to say that, as Joseph Epstein said better, a biography of any literary person ought to deal at length with what he or she read and when. For in some sense, we are what we read. Now, he said that, everybody got really excited. I read that and I say, that's right and insufficient, because we are not only what we read, but how we read. And here is where the plot thickens. When we read, if we are giving time, and this is a very important, this is the leitmotif. Time is leitmotif in the brain's processing. Time is leitmotif in the child's development. When we give time to what we are reading, we're not just connecting analogy to background knowledge, but we are leaving ourselves to take on the perspective of another, which is the basis of empathy and what Martha Nussbaum, the philosopher, calls the compassionate imagination. Now, as I told you, my colleague, my mentor, one of the best friends of my life, Father John Dunn, who died not that many years ago, used to talk about what he called passing over. And I use that to talk about perspective taking, that when we read, we pass over, as Father Dunn says, we pass over to others and come back to ourselves. We all have the capacity, but we do not all discover it, come to use it, learn to pass over. Reading is cumulatively teaching us to pass over into the thoughts and feelings of others. as Father Villano said at the outset about January 6th, when I look at what occurred, when I look at what social media and the absolute utter lack of complexity in most tweets, what you see is a recipe for giving insufficient time to other perspectives. One of the great worries I have is that within the digital culture, we become so divided that we are, as a society, overwhelmed with information, causing us paradoxically to going into familiar silos and calling that truth because it's familiar, because it supports our perspective, rather than involving ourselves in the perspectives of others. Now, when we do this, this is, to use Martha Nussbaum's term, part of what helps us have a compassionate imagination of others. This, if you will, capacity is one of the most important aspects that the reading brain brings to bear over time. It's building that. And it is one of the most important foundations for a future in an ever connected universe, an ever, I will start to say Earth, but the more I'm reading about us, my colleagues who are studying exoplanets, I couldn't help but make an association to the universe. But to return to Earth really quickly, one of the many things that helps us build empathy is the reading of fiction and novels and short stories. Because what we're doing, and I'm saying this as both a scientist and a student of literature for my entire life, we are entering the consciousness of others. We are passing over, as Father Dunn said, from one mind to the next. And fiction is a particularly wonderful vehicle for that. Now, my favorite novelist in the United States is Marilynne Robinson. Now, some of you know she wrote a beautiful book years ago, Housekeeping, but it's the trilogy that now has a fourth one that I most want any of you to read if you have not. Gilead was the first of the trilogy. She's won Pulitzer Prize. She's won one prize after another for all this. Gilead, Home, Lila. Now the fourth just came out, Jack. Now, for those of us who are Catholic with a small c and Catholic with a capital C, it is an absolutely fascinating excursion into a Calvinist mind, which is what Marilynne Robinson has. But inside all of her novels, inside the fictional worlds that she builds, they are largely taking place in the houses, the environs of two ministers in a tiny town in Iowa. And yet she builds these whole worlds in which we discover what it feels like to be other and to give our best capacity to understand that other, even if the other is completely different. Now, Obama made a very interesting interview with her. It's published. He, among other things, called her one of our greatest ambassadors of empathy. And he said that he learned more about empathy from novels than he did from government, that he learned more about the difference between black and white and everything gray in between from novels, that this is where he learned about empathy. It was fascinating to me. Now, remember, this is before the election in 2016 that this interview took place. Marilynne Robinson turned to Obama and said, the trend towards seeing those different as sinister other is the greatest danger to continuing our democracy. I wish that could have been a banner at January 6th over the halls of Congress, where we had people who were so completely of the opinion that others were enemies, that they went to the extremes that they did. And in so doing, endangered democracy at a horrible level. Well, there are various ways that we get empathy. And I wanted to do one tiny little experiment with you about imagery and its ability to provide empathy. Now, some of you, maybe most of you, know that Ernest Hemingway wrote a tiny little short story as the product of a wager, not Pascal type wager. His bourbon drinking buddies in Key West bet him he couldn't write a short story in 6 words. And this is what he wrote. And it is it's a very hard one, but it illustrates what I mean. For sale, baby shoes, never worn. When you look at these 6 words, you are immediately hit with a powerful image that helps you go deeper and deeper into empathy and compassion and analogy to your own life. Now, when you do that, as a neuroscientist, I need to tell you, you're doing a lot. You're not just activating feeling, you're activating whole areas of your brain that are responsible for theory of mind, how we think others think. This is what we're learning when we read and when we develop that reading brain circuit. We're using analogy, but we're also using inference. We're like the Sherlock Holmes, if you will, of scholarship. We are deducing. We are doing all of these things with our right and left frontal lobes, and we are saying, here's my hypothesis, and the right and the left are dancing, and at the end there's this imprimatur of truth that we say, yes, that's true. So what we are doing in critical analysis is we are connecting what is in front of us with all of these time-consuming, inferential, deductive processes that are helping us establish the truth. Now, those of you who are absolutely awake, and I know I am testing some of you, you need to think for yourself whether you give enough time to be critically analytic, because it takes time. We are evaluating or not. No one with a tweet is really evaluating. And the Swiss wrote this whole magazine article on my work in which I hated the title, but basically they're saying I'm in a war with the Twitter brain. Well, yes, I am, with the Twitter brain that doesn't process critically analytically. Now, those of you who with me are fans of Miss Marple, and you know, sometimes I show this slide and nobody knows who she is. So I hope that at least you do. But Miss Marple, when she was analytic about the murders that she was trying to do, she wasn't like Sherlock. She was like Sherlock plus empathy, understanding how empathy, how perspective taking, how inference, analogy, background knowledge, all have a role in the reading brain circuit. Now, in honor of today, I am going to give you 2 things. One is a quote from Marilynne Robinson, and one is my next slide. But I suggest to you that when we are our finest readers, we are using critical analysis and empathy as the basis for a moment, and these are millisecond moments of reflection and contemplation. So if you will, I even call this the Proustian pause, that we pull all this together and then we have room for our own thought. Proust said that at the heart of reading, we leave the wisdom of the author behind to discover our own. That's the acme of reading. And Marilynne Robinson's quote here is part of what I consider that which comes after critical analysis and empathy that is going missing in our culture. She said, if God has taken pleasure in his creation, some part is in your best idea, your most disciplined thinking on whatever is true, honorable, just, pleasing, and worthy of praise. Now I have quite a few slides left, but this is the one I want you to really think about. In the heart of reading is a moment when all of these deep reading processes come together and like a springboard can help you dive into your own best thoughts. May they be worthy of praise. May they be just and pleasing. And so at this point, what we are really talking about is that the contemplative pause is the moment of insight that we have. The moment when we move from what is to what might be, when we move into the generative. And I'm going to give you now my gift for the day. Father Mark, do you recognize this figure? It's
Our
Thomas!
friend Thomas.
Thomas Aquinas! Yay! I mean, not everyone, he's probably larger in girth than this picture. My wonderful artist, who's also a neuroscientist, Kat Studley, drew this for me. And basically, she didn't make him quite as big as he probably was. But I use him to illustrate all of the many processes that the deep reading brain has within it. And why? It's not just because it's his feast day. I can't see all of you, I can only see a few of you, but how many of you have read G.K. Chesterton's biography of Aquinas? Have some of you? Ah, good. Then you know this. When asked what he was most grateful for, he said, I am most grateful that I understood every page I ever read. Well, that's why I use him here. I certainly have never had that beautiful gift of being able to understand everything I ever read. But with Aquinas, St. Thomas, I can imagine he didn't move from the page until he did. And in so doing, I consider him, if you will, the patron saint of the deep reading brain and the contemplative function. But this gives you a sort of a saint's eye view of how beautiful that reading brain is. Now I'm going to give my last 10 slides more of a look at the evidence about change and what is happening to us. But I begin it actually with Aristotle, who said that a culture can be judged by how it pursues three lives: the life of activity, the life of enjoyment, and the life of contemplation. Well, so also the good reader, the society, the most of us are reading with this life of activity and productivity, and we also are reading for entertainment. And in the Greek sense, like Joseph Pieper, those of you who might remember his book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, how, you know, this is an important function. It's not just light stuff. Entertainment, culture is an important aspect, but there is a third life to the society and a third life to the good reader, and that's the life of contemplation. And it is being attacked by a society that, through no ill intention in the beginning, began to bombard our young, our middle, and our old with technological ways of communicating. Now, we know so much of what is good, but I want to suggest to you that there are real negatives when we look at some of the evidence from my colleagues on what is happening to children. I work with pediatricians, I work with pediatric neurologists, and we can tell you that the brain's activation, when you look at the same story, when it's being read to by a parent versus an audio version versus seeing all the bells and whistles on an iPad, the language areas are more activated through human interaction. And so what we have is evidence showing that these bells and whistles are not best for language development in our young. And so I in my new, or not so new now, 2018 book, I go in great detail about what is happening to our young. People like Naomi Barron are writing a new book for Oxford Press that will come out any minute, that is called How We Read, and it will also pull together the research in the last 3 years. I pulled together the research before then. But we see it from myriad ways. We see it from clinicians who talk about the children's need for this constant, continuous bombardment of stimulation, which has hormonal implications. And we have certainly clinicians who are seeing more attentional disorders or more problems with attention in our children. But it's not just the very young that I'm worried about. There's a study by Delgado and Salmeron. This is part of the Europeans e-read network, in which they did a meta-analysis. This is really important for some of your students. I know there are a few students on here. Your age group is part of a meta-analysis that was conducted for almost 20 years, where the simple task was read the story in print or digital and answer questions in comprehension. Over 171,000 participants. The results are very clear. Comprehension is better with print. Now, what about if we did a sub-analysis of the last years, where the kids are, by and large, these are high school and college age students, digital natives. These are the most digitally, if you will, absorbed in the study. What would the results be then? So in that sub-analysis, what you find is that the superiority for print is even better. Why? The reality is our students said, well, I read better on the screen because I read faster. So they perceive themselves doing better on the screen because of speed. The very speed that they believed leads them to illumination leads them, in fact, to short circuiting. They are skimming like everyone on this screen. Every one of you and I myself, half of the time we are working on a screen. There's with too much information, and so we're browsing, skimming, and we often use patterns that the eye movement researchers show are F's or Z's. And basically what that happened, excuse me one second. Basically what happens then is that there's less time given. Remember, the leitmotif for that brain circuitry is time. Less time is given to the concentration of attention on those deep reading processes. So we who live in an age of distraction, and for those of you who are biologists in some way, one shape or another, evolutionarily, we have a reflex to move our attention to what is novel. Those distractions on our screen, they grab us because we are evolutionarily programmed to have what's called a novelty reflex. So my colleagues are really showing us how distracted we all are, and what I am trying to figure out among all my colleagues who are working in this is, what does this mean? Well, I look at the poet T.S. Eliot. I look at Italo Calvino. And one of the things Eliot said has, I literally have it a quote always in front of me. Where is the wisdom lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge lost in information? I think there are extreme implications for readers in a society like ours, where we are bombarded by information, leading us to become distracted skimmers who give less time to understand complexity. And David Brooks actually wrote a column I don't know, maybe a year ago, where he said he looked up and beauty had gone missing. And I thought that was a perfect phrase for what happens when we skim the beauty of a Calvino or an Eliot poem. We are losing our perception of beauty, our ability to go beyond the surface of a single word in a poem is adding so much to our understanding. Beauty is not something people talk about as a deep reading process, but it is. But simultaneously, we are giving less time when we are skimming to understanding other perspectives and empathy. Where does that lead us? To me, it leads us directly and indirectly to January 6th, where we have citizens who are more susceptible to false information, who've never made an imprimatur dance between their lobes to decide the truth value of a statement, who look at the false fears and false hopes that are raised on their silos or on their news reports, and they don't have a balance, nor do they give time enough to analyze it. They are simply the victims, one more historical time, of demagoguery, whether it's demagoguery from a right-wing, white supremacist organization, or from leaders who, for reasons that I will not articulate, because this is not about politics at the level that that is associated. I'm talking about politics at the level of the Greek sense of people. We have people who are no longer able to discern truth value because they've become part of a tribe. That's why I'm eschewing the term political, becoming tribal, which forces a person to, not forces, it compels a person to accept without thinking messages that are false. All of this, in my estimation, is involved in a threat to our democracy. I use Cardinal Martino, and also he was with, I don't know if you can see this, Umberto Eco, in a beautiful work in which Martino said, the delicate game of democracy provides for a dialectic of opinions, just like Thomas's quote from the first slide that you showed, Father Villano. Such exchanges of perspectives will expand the collective moral conscience. That's what the good reader does. Takes on the perspective of others. Iron sharpens iron, says St. Thomas Aquinas. That's what a true, elaborated, expert reading brain circuit does for us and with us. I return to the philosopher Martha Nussbaum. It would be catastrophic to become a nation of technically competent people who have lost the ability to think critically, to examine themselves, and to respect the humanity and diversity of others. I'm not talking about binaries here, not talking about digital versus print. I'm talking about the need, as my colleague at MIT, Sherry Turkle, said, to look at not what is innovative as something wrong, but the refusal by us to figure out, or the neglect by us to be less negative and pejorative, the neglect by us when we do not allow ourselves to confront what is disrupted or diminished with what is innovative. And so in my last book, and I am trying very hard to do what Pope Francis actually called the reconciling thinking to the future. And I'm working on a developmental scaffolding for a deep reading brain that's biliterate, that begins with print, but simultaneously is teaching all these digital skills. But that deep reading begins with print, for all the reasons why I consider the time that print gives us an essential part of the development of literacy for children. So I end here with the last two slides. The greatest test ever made of human wisdom and decency may very well come to this generation or the next. We must teach and learn broadly and seriously. My dear friend, Father Dunn, is the way I will end with you today. Wisdom is not contemplation alone, not action alone, but contemplation in action. And that, my friends, is what I leave you with. So that's it.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Wolf. When I used the word urgency about your title, I think I see it all the more, having gone on this little journey with you. I'm going to open it up to questions, but if you don't mind, I'll begin. So gather your thoughts, others. I want to flip a little, maybe between reading and writing. Like a lot of people here, I've been in the classroom at the front of the room while students are taking notes on their laptops, tablets, things like that. And I know different professors have different thoughts about that. I've heard, and it rings true to me, that people are absorbing more if they're taking notes with a pencil because there's some kind of connection there, the tactile and the brain, they're absorbing in a different way. On the other hand, I allow note-taking electronically. Now I know we're not talking about necessarily the reading brain, but the writing brain, but what's the connection and what's your view of that? I mean, I'm sure if I was in the back of the room looking at what they're looking at, maybe they're not all taking notes either.
Well, I will admit, I will tell you two things on this. I will admit having in a class of 150 students, my teaching fellows at the back of the room looking down at my students at what they are actually doing as they're note-taking on their laptops. You can imagine they are doing everything in addition to their note-taking. They are on eBay. They are writing notes to their friends. So on the one hand, we can worry about that and say, well, it's up to them to get the most out of a class. But you know what? They are young, and they don't necessarily have the same, if you will, experience that we do about how important it is to have less distraction when we're concentrating. And so I use in my own work, especially in Boston, I only when they absolutely have to use a laptop are they given that right to do it. And there are conditions in which they were. Well, when I came to UCLA, my new colleague, Patricia Greenfield, actually studied this. And she has a new study, which is conducted with a teaching, my own postdoc. They did a study, and I'm not sure it's published yet, but it will be. She divided the class. Now I'm saying this. Is this Gabriel? Gabriel, are you listening to this? Were you in Patricia Greenfield's classes by any chance?
No.
Okay, she's in psychology. But anyway, so she had this group who used the laptop and the group who used, just note taking. So let's just vote. Who did better at the end of the course on the exams? Who votes for the laptoppers? Who votes for the ones who took notes by hand? That's what happened. The ones who, deliberately, and they're, just as you said, Father Mark, you're adding a motoric element. You're adding some really interesting additions that help consolidate in memory. Now, that's not true for everyone. And that's going to be one of the things that we study over time. There's individual variation here. I study dyslexic kids, and for a dyslexic child or adult, a laptop and note-taking is going to be much better. I happen to have two grown sons. Grown now, but I spent a lifetime with one dyslexic and one dysgraphic child. The dysgraphic child writes to this moment. He's at Google, by the way, like a third grader. He can no more take notes than a third grader in a college course. So for some of our students, there's a variation on this, but by and large, you are going to give more heft, if you will, to your concentration and attention, at least that these data are indicating when you take notes. It's interesting. It's interesting. But that's Patricia Greenfield. It's her newest study, and I'm very curious when it's published, but it's going to be published very soon.
And just to follow up, there's all these new teaching methods involving polling during class and things like that. And I wonder also, in terms of even during the instruction, are those things helping, or are they hindering, or is it a combination there?
I think it's a combination, because the importance of engagement in learning is such a serious aspect of my lecture. Now, I didn't have a gallery view of you, but I'm sure I did not engage all of you the whole time. And sometimes I have various things that I do to help engage the reader, the viewer, the learner. And so some of the polling has the best intentions of engaging or redirecting attention. The problem, so there's a yes and a no, the problem is that it's distracting. And so it can actually derail some of our attention. I personally don't use it. I don't want it. I want to do my absolute best to grab their attention. And because of interaction in a class, I see who isn't with me. And, I'm sure all of you have been teachers. You can see in their eyeballs whether they're with you or whether they aren't. You know it. And you know whether or not you feel the responsibility to grab them or not. And there are sometimes when I have 150 kids, or I don't do that now here at UCLA, but when I had those kids there, I absolutely, especially it was under 100. I tried really hard to know their names, and I would call on them. Polling head, there's nothing like Marcia. What do you think about Piaget's? Whatever.
Right.
I'm kidding, but I'm not kidding. Polling has the positive and the negative aspects, like so much of digital technology. It's how we use it carefully, and not just assume that it's going to do everything that it's meant to. We have to use technology carefully, not assume that it's an answer.
Thank you. I want to open it up to the gallery now. Anyone would like to ask some questions?
If I may.
Yes.
Hello. Mike, can I talk? No. Or somebody else?
Oh, I think Giorgio's first. Giorgio?
Well, you direct it, since I don't know people.
Okay.
Well, I wanted to thank you both very much. It was a memorable lecture, and you certainly got us engaged very much. So thanks to Father Villano for organizing this, and to you. It's wonderful to see you as a new colleague. We are, my wife Maryanne and I are in Mesopotamian history and archaeology. And
Oh,
so we've been
We were
interested.
thrilled to see the cuneiform that you had up there.
Oh, yes, yes. You're one of
That's
the
right.
few who noticed.
Absolutely. And also because we and I in particular have been working quite a bit on the origin of writing.
Oh, yes.
And your distinction of the 3 points, the oral, the written, writing, and the digital, is
Yes.
something that's I've been working quite a bit on, precisely on those 3 epochal moments.
Yeah.
So I would like to remain in touch since we are on the same campus. I would like to be in touch personally. But I wanted to just make one point, which in a way seems to be similar to what Father Mark said, but it's really different. It is about writing, but not writing in terms of taking notes on paper with pencil and paper, but in terms of constructing an argument.
Yes.
I think that one of the things I have been trying to do has been to develop what you might call deep writing, deep digital writing.
Yes.
In other words, we really have not gone very much beyond a PDF in terms of scholarly writing. If by writing we mean the development of an argument, not the construction of a database, important as that is, but the development of an argument and the possibility of having multilinear narratives that go on at the same time is something that digitality makes possible, amplifying what we have been doing instinctively with our own mind when writing. So I think it's my current task is really to develop as ways of a digital writing that presents a discourse, a digital discourse, in effect, that combines narrative with databases in ways that are not possible really with the print, if you will, or even the PDF in a sense is really, it's para-digital because it mimics very much the printed version. It goes a little beyond because it allows searching and such, and hyperlinks to some extent. But it's essentially really still a very fixed and static narrative.
Yes.
So the development instead of a real digital discourse is, I think, an important task for us as scholars. And that's what we have been trying to do really, Marilynne and I, with regard to archaeology in particular, that is integrating the data from an excavation into a overall narrative, which is really not done in our discipline. So I hope we can stay in touch.
Oh, I would love to have lunch with you both after COVID. That would be a delight. And you know, even though, so Father Villano, if you would give me everyone's email so that I just know, have the emails, because there is, I'd like you to know about an MIT professor in the sciences who is really trying to do something similar to what you're saying. They're trying to reframe how we write science articles. So I'm going to see if I can connect the two of you, because I think there's some correspondence.
Wonderful. Thank you.
That would be really interesting. I'm going to say one other quick thing that's related peripherally, but is on the more disturbing side. There have been those who are analyzing how we read arguments within articles. And what they're finding out is that these are graduate student level. What they're finding out is that if you look at what the student paper refers to, they are skipping the arguments. They are going from first page to last page with little reference to what goes into the argumentation itself. And so one of the things that this colleague at MIT is, I think, trying to do is, how can we forefront the argument in a better way?
Exactly.
So,
Perfect.
you know, I will hope to goodness I can connect to.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
John O'Keefe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Professor Wolf, I'm not an academic, but I really think I got your lecture very well. It's a wonderful lecture. And you mentioned early on that Aquinas welcomed argumentation. It shapes thought. And it seems to me in these very political and partisan times now that many of us are not willing to try that method, that argumentation method, for fear of causing a rift with a friend or a colleague. Or I think this is occurring all over the country with Congress also. What can we do about this to kind of unify our country a little better here? Because we're in terrible shape right now.
You know, I couldn't agree with you more. It's as if discourse, and I think, you know, I think I'm originally from the Midwest, and I think how Senator Lugar is an example of a Republican who really used civil discourse across the party lines in the Senate. And then when he lost his primary to a very, if you will, more right-wing extremist, it was a Tea Party person, I despaired, because I saw that as the harbinger of what we have now. These people who don't look at rhetoric. Rhetoric is out the window. You know, we don't have people who are listening. We have people who are just shouting their position. And what you're asking for in a certain sense is, if only we could teach rhetoric again and have the place of oral discourse as something we learn and value. And now, you know, I have a family that in the Midwest that is completely divided.
Likewise.
Completely divided. And I will love them to pieces, but they have no capacity. I will send article after article, no capacity to read them and take on another perspective. And what I can't understand, or maybe I'm beginning to understand, is that we all of us, belong to a kind of elite society in which logic and rationality, since the Enlightenment, have been prominent. And as a scientist in neuroscience, and also a person who's studied literature before that, it was always my thought that data and logic would prevail. And I'm wrong. I am completely wrong. In fact, next week, I'm going to be in a panel in which the title is Evidently, Evidence is Not Enough. It's as if science, data, evidence, logic has taken a back seat to the irrational and the who's louder, who evokes more passion, if you will. This is a really strange moment for us. So my hope, and this is a really, we'll see, we're only in the first week. My hope is that the experience of someone who was a senator during Lugar's time, person who really made an effort his whole life to compromise, to see both sides, whether we have been so fortunate, especially since I was a Pete Buttigieg fan. We are so fortunate, I believe, to have someone who is really a seasoned, rational person, but who has feeling. And, we had the former president was just, vacuous emotion with no logic, no science, no rationality. I'm not speaking as a politician here at all, just speaking cognitively. I've analyzed, for right or wrong, I've analyzed trying to figure out why rational theory no longer works. And it's because, at least in part, because we have disrespected science and logic and the Enlightenment. So how do we bring that to bear?
Listen.
I don't know.
Let me offer just because we have a couple of minutes left, if there's a final question, and then I want to end with I think a very apropos prayer, but any final questions? Yes, Rich.
Hi, Maryanne.
Hi, Rich. I hope to meet you someday.
I'd love to have that. What a wonderful lecture. Just to second what John had to say quickly, it's amazing to me how people don't want to listen to dialectical, our argumentation. And I was really surprised the other day. I made some comment on Facebook posting about when Trump had that unethical dialogue with the Georgian secretary,
Yeah.
And I was amazed that I had prompted about 50 to 60 comments that were all civil. And I could not believe it. But my question to you is that I want to thank you because I have a niece and nephew who are just raising their child. And so I kind of prompted them to some of your publications, including the Come Home.
Yeah.
Reader
Come home to them.
Exactly. And I love what you had to say in that when you said I'd begun to read more to be informed than to be immersed, much less than to be transported. And I understand that because I can't read anything deeply without my dictionary. I cannot go through anything if I don't understand every single word. Words matter to me. And to me, it's really uplifting to find the youth, sort of embracing that as well, including the recently youth poet laureate, Amanda Gorman.
Unbelievable.
Right. And so that was a real treat to see that. But having said that, with the younger minds and knowing that my niece and nephew are just raising their children, with all the studies and work you've done with the young, is there have you seen a certain time to introduce the youth to more things of a digital nature and versus the storybooks?
Yeah. So what I've actually written about there's 2 to 3 chapters in Reader Come Home specifically about that. So only because of time, I will just say there's a lot of information in the book about that, with pediatricians and myself agreeing the least amount of digital introduction during the first 2 years, the next 3 years very gradual, and then limited but specifically aimed in particular areas from 5 to 10. So, but there's a lot of things that in those chapters 5, 6, and 7 that would be of help.
Terrific. Thank you.
Reader Come Home.
Well, Maryanne, speaking for the staff at the UCC, we can't wait to see you back on the balcony of our chapel, and surrounded by all the students again when we're able to do that.
Yeah.
Many, many, many thanks for your presentation today. You did grab our attention, and now I'm going to be able to share this with others too. I'm going to go back just towards the end here now. To our patron saint today,
Yes.
St. Thomas Aquinas, one of his prayers. I'll pray it and feel free to pray along with me. Are you able to see that? Did that come up?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, good.
Oops, that's the wrong one. Let me go back to the end here.
The beautiful one. I love it.
All right, well, here's his prayer. Give me, O Lord, a steadfast heart, which no unworthy thoughts can drag downwards, an unconquered heart, which no tribulation can wear out, an upright heart, which no unworthy purpose may tempt aside. Bestow upon me also, O Lord my God, understanding to know thee, diligence to seek thee, wisdom to find thee, and a faithfulness that may finally embrace thee. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.